I've never been one for urban legends or the paranormal. In my world, everything followed a strict logic. If a floorboard creaked, the house was just settling. If there was a rustle in the attic, it was probably raccoons. I moved to this Ohio suburb 6 months ago, buying a cookie-cutter 2-story house with white vinyl siding and a perfectly manicured lawn. It was the quintessential American suburb, where life moved at a crawl, and the biggest drama on the neighborhood Facebook group was an illegally parked pickup truck or weeds in someone's garden. My routine was monotonous. I work remotely as a data analyst, so my world was confined to my monitor and the large bay window overlooking the driveway. The silence here was deafening, especially after the sun dipped below the horizon. I saw him for the first time on a Tuesday. It was one of those raw October evenings when the fog rolls off the asphalt, turning the streetlights into blurry yellow smudges. I had just finished a report and stepped to the window to stretch my neck. Across the street, standing directly under a lamppost, was a man. He wore a tattered gray overcoat that looked far too light for the chill. Tall and unnaturally thin, he stood perfectly still. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched, but something about his posture was wrong. He wasn't just standing there, he was staring directly at my house. I squinted, trying to make out his face. The distance was significant, but the streetlight hit him just right. He was smiling. It wasn't a normal, friendly neighborly smile. His lips were stretched so wide it looked physically impossible. In the dim light, his teeth gleamed like polished porcelain. Freak, I muttered to myself, drawing the curtain shut. I made some tea and tried to put it out of my mind. Ohio is full of eccentric people. I figured he was a local drifter or someone with mental health issues. I didn't give it another thought until I went to bed. But even in the darkness of my bedroom, every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that frozen, dead grimace of joy. The next morning, when I went out to grab the mail, I couldn't help but look at the spot where he had stood. The grass there was matted down, as if something heavy had been resting on it for hours. And there, in the mud left by the rain, I saw deep boot prints. They were pointed straight toward my window. I went back inside and, for the first time since moving in, I turned the deadbolt on the front door. The sense of security I had prized in this neighborhood began to peel away, layer by layer, like old paint. Wednesday was spent in a state of sticky anticipation. I couldn't focus on my spreadsheets. The numbers on the screen blurred into meaningless patterns. Every time a car drove by an Amazon van or a neighbor's SUV, I flinched. In our suburb, it's customary to wave at passersby. But now I found myself hiding behind the kitchen curtains, watching the world through a narrow slit. The sun began to sink behind the rooftops of the identical houses, staining the sky the color of clotted blood. I forced myself to stay away from the window. At 6 p.m., I turned the TV volume up, trying to drown out the silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. At 6:15 p.m., I broke. My legs carried me to the living room of their own accord. I slowly nudged the blinds aside. He was there, but this time, he wasn't under the streetlight across the street. He had crossed the asphalt. This man was standing right on the edge of my lawn, next to my mailbox. The distance had been cut in half. In the glow of my own garage light, I could see him much more clearly. The gray coat was stained with dampness and road grime. He was unnaturally stooped, yet still very tall. His head was tilted at an angle that made his neck look broken, and the smile, God, it had grown wider. I could see his gums now pale, almost white. He wasn't just looking at the house, he was staring directly into the gap in the blinds I had left open. A surge of rage, born of absolute fear, washed over me. I threw open the front door and stepped out onto the porch. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice echoing through the quiet street. "This is private property. Get the hell out of here or I'm calling the cops." He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. The smile remained a frozen mask, as if carved out of cheap plastic. The wind whipped the hem of his coat, but his body was a monolith, rooted into my soil. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? A calm female voice answered. There is a trespasser on my property. He's standing in front of my house and won't leave. I've threatened him with the police, but he isn't reacting. Please send someone. A patrol car arrived 20 minutes later. The blue and red lights illuminated the facades of the neighboring houses. 2 officers, Miller and Sanchez, stepped out unhurriedly. But when they walked up to my mailbox, no one was there. It was empty. Just darkness and light fog. "Sir, are you sure he was here?" Miller asked, shining a high-powered flashlight into the bushes. "We cruised the whole block, not a soul on foot. He was standing right here." I pointed at the trampled grass by the mailbox. Gray coat, tall, with this. Creepy smile. He wouldn't move. Look, Sanchez sighed, holstering his light. It's October. Kids like to mess around before Halloween. It was probably some high schooler trying to get a rise out of you. Get a ring camera or a motion sensor floodlight. If he comes back, call us. But right now we've got nobody to pick up. They left, leaving me alone with the empty street. I stood on the porch, feeling as though 100 eyes were watching me from the tree line that bordered my backyard. I went inside and engaged the heavy-duty Bolt ID installed that afternoon. But as I passed the hallway window, I noticed something that wasn't there before. On the glass, at the level of a human face, was a foggy smudge. It looked as if someone had pressed their forehead against the window and stared inside for a long time. And the smudge wasn't on the outside. It was on the inside. Cold sweat trickled down my spine as I stared at the foggy smudge on the inside of the glass. It was impossible. I was alone in the house. I had checked every corner, every closet, every window latch in the basement. The house was empty, but the mark of greasy, damp smear from a human forehead and the tip of a nose remained. He had been here. He had gotten inside. Thursday became a day of absolute paranoia. I didn't go to work. Instead, I drove to the nearest Home Depot and bought 3 additional security cameras and a heavy-duty sliding bolt for my bedroom door. On my way back, I saw my neighbor from 2 houses down, Mrs. Green, pruning her roses. I wanted to ask if she'd seen anything strange, but I froze. She was smiling. It was just a polite, elderly lady smile, but now, any stretching of the lips looked like a predator's snarl to me. I practically ran back inside. Evening came too fast. Heavy clouds rolled over the suburbs, and the wind began to howl through the attic vents. I locked every door and sat in the living room, armed with a heavy flashlight and a kitchen knife. I didn't turn on the lights. I wanted to see him first. 6:15 p.m. I cautiously nudged the edge of the curtain. My heart nearly hammered out of my chest. He wasn't by the mailbox. He was on my porch, just inches away from the front door. Now I could see him so clearly that I could make out the texture of his coat. It looked like it had been exhumed from a grave. His face was pressed against the decorative glass pane of the door. Because of the glass's distortion, his smile looked even more grotesque, seemingly taking up the entire bottom half of his face. He didn't knock. He just waited. I backed away into the hallway, trying not to make a sound. My phone was in my hand, my thumb hovering over the call button. And then I heard it. A low, rhythmic sound from deep inside the house. Creak, creak, creak. The sound wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the kitchen. Someone was walking slowly across the hardwood, intentionally stepping on the creakiest boards. I froze, holding my breath. A shadow flickered in the kitchen doorway. It was tall and thin. I caught a scent, a sharp, sickly sweet smell of formaldehyde and old paper. My legs went weak. He couldn't be there. I had seen him on the porch a second ago. I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam toward the kitchen. The light hit nothing but empty space. But on the white tile floor, there were wet boot prints. They led from the back door straight toward the basement stairs. At that moment, the power went out. Every appliance, the hum of the fridge, the router lights, everything died. All that remained was a dead silence and the narrow beam of my flashlight. Then came a whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't words, it was a sound mimicking laughter, but without any mirth. Just a dry, guttural rasp. I bolted for the second floor, slammed my bedroom door shut, and slid the new bolt home. I dialed 911, huddling in the corner between the bed and the wall. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was distorted by heavy static. Hez inside? I screamed in a whisper, choking back sobs. The man in the gray coat. Hez in my house. Please, I'm begging you, send the police now. 142 Oak Court. Hurry, sir. Calm down, the dispatcher replied. Her voice suddenly changed. It became slow, syrupy. We're already here. Why aren't you smiling, Mark? I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the screen in horror. The call had disconnected a minute ago. Only static hissed from the speaker. And then I heard the knocking. Not on the bedroom door. The knocking was coming from under my bed. Thump, thump, thump. And a slow, bony hand in a filthy gray sleeve began to crawl out from under the mattress. Its fingers digging into the carpet right at my feet. I screamed. The sound wasn't human, it was the gasp of a drowning man realizing there is no surface. I lunged away, knocking over the nightstand. And in the final flicker of the lamp before it hit the floor, I saw a figure rising slowly from under the bed, like a piece of unfolding origami. Bones popped like dry twigs under a hunter's boot. It wasn't a man. No human could have folded themselves into the narrow space beneath that bed. The gray coat now seemed to be part of its skin, merging with its skeletal shoulders. I lunged for the door, fingers clawing at the bolt. It was jammed. I jerked it so hard I tore my fingernails, leaving bloody streaks on the painted wood. A rustle came from behind. It was standing at its full height. I felt its icy breath on the back of my neck. It smelled of earth, deep grave damp, and old clothes forgotten in a trunk. Please, I pleaded, not daring to turn around. In response came a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was a whizzing, bubbling intake of breath, followed by a whisper that was far too clear for such a creature. I just wanted to watch. At that moment, blue and red lights flashed outside the window. The distant sirens I had heard earlier hadn't been a hallucination. The actual patrol I had called before the phone went haywire had finally reached Oak Court. Bam! 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 Police! Open up! Officer Miller's shout from the first floor sounded like a divine thunderclap. The shadow behind me froze. I felt the air pressure shift. Spinning round, I saw that the corner of the room was empty. The bedroom window, which I had personally locked with 2 latches, was flung wide open. The curtains whipped violently in the wind, letting in the cold night rain. I ripped the bolt open and tumbled down the stairs, nearly colliding with Officer Sanchez, who was already kicking in the front door. As here, he was in my bedroom. I sobbed, clutching the officer's tactical vest. They moved professionally. Miller cleared the upstairs with his service weapon drawn, while Sanchez stayed with me, scanning the living room. 5 minutes later, Miller came down, his face pale. There's no one there, Mark, but he hesitated, searching for words. You'd better look at this. We went up to the bedroom. Lying on my pillow was something that made me gag. It was an old, yellowed Polaroid. It showed this very house, but 40 years ago. A young couple stood on the porch, and behind them, in the second-floor window, my current bedroom window, was a tall silhouette in a gray overcoat. But that wasn't the terrifying part. On the back of the photo was a message written in fresh, still damp ink. You look so beautiful when you aren't smiling. The police stayed at my house until morning, but they found no signs of forced entry and no fingerprints other than my own. The only evidence was a wet trail on the carpet leading to the window, but it dried faster than the forensics team could sample it. I moved out that same night. I didn't pack bags or grab clothes. I just got in my car and drove until sunrise, until I crossed the state line. I live in Seattle now, in a modern glass and concrete apartment on the 20th floor. There are no lawns here, no cozy suburban streets, and no room for shadows in gray coats. But every night, before I get into bed, I check the locks 3 times. And sometimes, when I pass the mirror in the dark hallway, I find myself scrutinizing my own reflection. I look at my lips, terrified that I'll see them begin to stretch, slowly and against my will, into that same wide, impossible smile. Because yesterday, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. There was no letter inside, only a small, silver staple exactly like the ones I saw pinning the lips of that thing. He didn't leave, he's just waiting for me to relax again.